Good afternoon. Welcome to the final Master of Arts Management speaker series of this academic year. I'm Jessica Bowser-Akery, Program Director of the Masters of Arts Management program at Carnegie Mellon University, a skills-based, future-facing, policy and tech-driven approach to arts management education that is a joint degree offered from the College of Fine Arts and Heinz College of Information Systems and Public Policy. Today's Masters of Arts Management series, Time for Monumental Change, is supported in part by the Sylvia and David Steiner Speaker Series and the Frank Ratchey Studio for Creative Inquiry. Welcome Masters of Arts Management student and alumni and members of the campus-wide community. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that CMU occupies land that belonged to the Osage Nation, as well as other Native tribes and people. As the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, I want to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. We are pleased to have three powerhouse speakers join us today. Kilolo Luckett is a Pittsburgh-based art historian, curator, and founding executive director, chief curator of the ALMA Loomis Experimental Contemporary Art Platform. She recently served as an arts commissioner for the City of Pittsburgh's Art Commission for 12 years. Kirk Savage joins us from our neighbor just down the street, the University of Pittsburgh, where he is a history of art and architecture professor. For over 30 years, Kirk has written about public monuments and public art as they intersect with the issues of loss, trauma, deindustrialization, militarism, and racial justice. Christy S. Coleman has held leadership roles at the American Civil War Museum, the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History, and currently serves as the executive director of the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. She is a tireless advocate for the power of museums, narrative correction, and diversity and inclusivity. We hope to go behind the news cycles and recent headlines of the current public debates happening across the country, centered on the removal and contextualization of monuments and public art. The format of today's presentation will go as follows. We will hear from each speaker for about 10 minutes, followed by about 15 minutes of conversation between the three of them. And then finally, we'll take a few questions from the audience. I ask that everyone remain muted throughout the presentations and conversations. When it comes time for Q&A, I will moderate the chat room and or call on individuals who have raised their blue Zoom hands. So, without further delay, I would like to welcome Ms. Luckett to speak first. She will be followed by Kurt Savage and finally, Christy S. Coleman. So, welcome, Kilolo. I hate this Zoom room, by the way. No applause. I hear applause in my head, just by the way. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jessica, for having me, and welcome and greetings, everybody. I'm going to share my screen and jump right in there. I'm going to put myself on a timer as well. So, and feel free to jump in if I go over time. So, all right. All right, can everybody see my screen?
We can.
Okay, great. Great, so time for monumental change. Yes, my name is Kilolo Luckett, and I'm the executive director and chief curator of ALMA Lewis, which is based here in Pittsburgh. All right, let me get to the next one. So yes, as Jessica said, I spent over about 12 years of my volunteer life as a commissioner for the City of Pittsburgh's Art Commission, and up until last year. And these two monuments here on your left and right, here I'll get my little laser pointer out too. This one here, the Stephen Foster Memorial, and then the Christopher Columbus. These were two monuments that were pretty contested, and there were so many different perspectives, and we can talk a little bit about that. But I also wanted to point out this monument. It's called The Wounded Scout, Friend in the Swamp by John Rogers, and this was this is a bronze monument that was made in 1864. So if you think about what was going on in our country in 1864, just to put that into some context as far as what and whom are monuments for, and what purpose do monuments serve. And so I want to kind of just peel back that a little bit, because our society in the United States is very much, we tend to valorize certain figures, and we have a sort of sentimentality that has to do with, looking up and elevating one particular person or a group of people. And I tend to, in my practice as an art historian and curator, is always question, why do we see what we see, especially in the public realm? And how long has that been how long has it been this way? And so with this figure here, Stephen Foster, for those who don't know, he was a musician, a writer, but it's called the Stephen Foster Memorial, but it's also has this figure here who is actually a made up person. It's a fictitious person, a Black man who is very much looked down upon. If you look at the way in which the construction of this whole situation, it's kind of like a performance. And so that's something else that I would question whenever I saw this piece. And this piece was, up until recently, in Oakland, in between the Carnegie Museum of Art and Natural History Museum and the University of Pittsburgh, in a very prominent area. And then this monument, Christopher Columbus, was in a very public space as well by Phipps Conservatory near CMU's campus. It's actually situated between CMU, University of Pittsburgh, and Phipps. So let me go to the next one. So this is a different public piece. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the artist Ruth Asawa. People tend to know Ruth's work with those beautiful wire mesh sculptural hanging pieces. But this is a commissioned work that she did. It was called Andrea. It was placed in San Francisco's Girardelli Square in 1968. And once again, context, social context, cultural contexts matter. And she did this because she herself was a mother of 6 children. And there was this, she really thought about like what it meant for her to be an artist holding a space as a mother too. And so she created this pretty powerful work of mermaids, basically providing nourishment to children. And this created a pretty big public outrage by the landscape architect who worked on this installation, and just thought it was just an abomination. And once again, it's like, who is calling into question what gets seen and why? And not really understanding where Ruth was coming from, they really felt very uncomfortable first seeing women and also women breastfeeding. And that was something else that I thought was very interesting when I was just reading up about Ruth and some of her public commissions. But I'm going to go back to forward, but I'm going back to these sets of images. And if you see this, these are all men, right? And this was a real person. This is a make believe person, a fictitious person. And then these two, this is a white soldier, basically being carried, being helped by a Black person, an enslaved person. So once again, who's holding the power? What's the perception? And those are things, once again, that I very much question. So I'm going to move to these 2 images. The image on your left is by Sonia Clark, and it's called Unraveling. And Sonia, I love her work. She's a multidisciplinary artist, works with fiber works, and she basically looks at the foundations, the foundations of our founding country, and looks at what does the American flag, what does a Confederate flag, what does the Union flag, what does all of these symbols mean? And so we as society need to really question like these positions of power. And I wanted to use this image by Sonia Clark, her work, and juxtaposed by Gordon Parks' photograph of the American Gothic from Washington, D.C. And this calls into like, who is a patriot? You know, we tend to think of people who are patriotic as being very American, and also what does that look like? And we tend to not think of somebody who is a patriot as a Black woman, a domestic worker. So these next sets of slides are images that Edward Weston took from the South, and then these two black and white images, and then these lower two images are photographs taken by the artist Beverly Buchanan. And she went, she was from the South, and she looked at images of building structures that really called into question like these structures of who built these structures, and you know, and also the systems of economies that have to do with these structures. And so she photographed throughout the South and looking at building structures, vernacular architecture, and created these beautiful small wooden pieces that really mimicked the photographs that she saw. And so she started looking at these structures as portraits that honored people and communities. And this is something that I thought, okay, what would it look like if we moved away from actual figures and valorizing certain people to paying tribute to groups of people, communities, places that are no longer around. And so Beverly Buchanan has done these beautiful ruins from historical sites, and she would pull them together and create these beautiful, very reflective places that one could go and learn more about what used to be there on this site. And then just jumping forward to some works that I actually had the pleasure of creating, helping to organize, was when one of my first jobs out of college, I was a curatorial assistant at Wood Street Galleries. That's part of the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust down in downtown Pittsburgh. And this piece is called Palazzo Nudo, and this was built in 1999 by the artist Alexander Brodsky. And he basically took a lot of the pieces of details from buildings that were demolished in downtown Pittsburgh, and he constructed this futuristic kind of, I would say, scaffolding that basically housed all of these fragmented, ornate pieces. And this was a temporary installation. And first people were like wondering what was going on here. But yet as folks started to better understand what was going on and started to identify the different pieces of history, people really fell in love with this structure. And so this is something else that I'm always looking at as far as like, how can we deconstruct certain symbols and identities to make it a much more communal way of us gathering together. And this is this beautiful piece called Palazzo Nudo. All right, and just wanted to show a couple more images. This is another public piece that was outside the August Wilson African American Cultural Center that I worked on. And this is the work of Martha Jackson Jarvis. She's a Washington-based artist, and it's called Two Steps from the Blues. And it's a steel and powder-coated pigments that she put together. And this is very much a very conceptual, abstract piece, but it is in reference to the history of blues and also the history of coal mining. And I just thought that this was a beautiful way that she paid tribute to these movements in different periods of time and people that were working. And it also reflected back on our industrial era here in Pittsburgh. And then lastly, this is the work of Thaddeus Mosley. He's a 94-year-old sculptor based here in Pittsburgh, and he works a lot in wood, but his work recently was created and made into these bronze pieces. These are these abstract forms. And once again, you know, Thad's work talks about spirituality and nature and the environment and our place in the world as human beings. And I just thought that this was a very poetic way of ending, and just for us to just think a little bit more about how public monuments can work outside the framework of figuration, and to really embrace other modes of creating work. But also, public art is not only about representation or symbolism. We have to think deeper to think about the structural mechanisms that go into these works and addressing racism, power, class, sexism, all of that. So that's all that I want to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask Kirk to join us and bring you up to spotlight you, Kirk. So I think as soon as, there we go.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jessica, for inviting me into this conversation, and I'm really looking forward to it. And I'm just going to make a few remarks, try to leave as much time as possible for the group discussion later on. And I wanted to start by asking the question, you know, what is a monument or a memorial? Because it's a question that's not just a philosophical question, but it's also a practical issue with consequences for funding and for regulation and other sorts of issues. So I'm on the advisory board of an organization called Monument Lab, which is based in Philadelphia. And Monument Lab was just a really shoestring kind of passion project organization until recently, when it's been given a couple of major grants, including a multi-million-dollar grant from the Mellon Foundation, which has really transformed it. But the Mellon Foundation, when they gave them their $4 million, asked them to do a national audit or a national inventory of monuments in the United States, to get some sense of, you know, what is represented in the landscape, right? How many, you know, what percentage of the statues are women or people of color, so on. Those are the kinds of issues, you know, what kinds of stories are being told, what kinds of stories are not being told. But of course, you know, with the first question that came up was what should be included in this audit? What should be excluded in this audit? You know, what do we have capacity to deal with, but also what do we want to deal with? And most people, you know, think of statues. They think of monuments by the most conventional definition. They think of statues, or, in the more recent history of monuments, we have been erecting walls with names or other kinds of structures that have spatial experience in them. We're less interested in a way in statues, but these are the kinds of sort of conventional statues and structures that have long been considered monuments because of their permanence and their permanence in public space. The problem is that if we only focus on these sorts of monuments, we are restricting our focus to dominant groups in our society, which have historically had the privilege and the power to erect monuments in public that promote their own agendas. So public space is not neutral. It's not open to everyone equally, even now, but particularly in the past, marginalized groups have been shut out of public space almost entirely. But even when marginalized communities have been shut out of the decision-making over public space, that doesn't mean that they haven't been doing collective memory work. They have been participating in collective memory work in many other ways, like naming places or buildings that are within their control, or erecting temporary shrines or markers, or even just passing down stories through the generations through oral traditions. And these are have been mostly unremarked in mainstream memory, but have been very important in keeping alive alternative traditions and alternative stories, which we can now, I think, focus on more or bring to the forefront more. So the problem is that if we focus only on permanent statues and structures, we get a skewed picture of memorialization that actually erases the knowledge and experience of many communities, many marginalized communities. So one of the questions that Jessica asked me to maybe try to address is the question of how we study monuments and what are the methodological issues involved in studying monuments. Of course, once we decide what monuments are, even if we restrict ourselves to conventional monuments, to study just one of these monuments is an enormously complicated undertaking. Monuments are collaborative enterprises. They involve designers, funders, politicians, bureaucrats. So many different kinds of actors are involved in the process of bringing a monument into public space. And then the monuments themselves are built on many, many layers of history and myth. They're not just kind of one-offs. They come into being because there's already been a process of memorialization and myth making that has made them possible. So if I just take one example, I'll take the example that Kilolo showed of the Columbus Monument here in Pittsburgh. And when she was chair of the Art Commission, the Columbus Monument was coming under review for possible removal. And so she and the Art Commission asked me to talk for 15 minutes in a public meeting about the historical context for Columbus monuments. I took this assignment on, I think not realizing just how challenging that was going to be. It's extraordinarily challenging because this monument, like most monuments, the Columbus Monument in Pittsburgh is kind of like an onion with many, many layers, and peeling back all the layers is a lot of work. So on the, sort of top layer, we have Italian-American organization that sponsored the monument, like many Italian-American organizations that adopted Columbus as a native son, starting in the late 19th century, but really getting rolling in the 20th century. And they did this, adopted Columbus as a kind of native son and hero to counter the history of discrimination that they themselves had experienced as immigrants to this country. And Columbus was an excellent figure in their eyes to legitimize Italian Americans as kind of true, Italian immigrants as true Americans. But of course, the problem was that there was a long history around Columbus, stretching back long before Italian Americans ever got involved with his memory, going all the way back to what he did on the island of Hispaniola 5 centuries ago, which is really quite horrific. But also including how the myth of Columbus was used in the early history of the United States by white people, by the founders and kind of Anglo settlers of this country as a justification for the conquest of native peoples. So by the time Italian Americans had adopted Columbus kind of as their mascot, he already came with a lot of baggage. So methodologically, this is difficult, right, to get a handle on. If you're an artist or arts professional or a student or educator who wants to engage in this space, you do need to get informed about these issues. And it's somewhat easier now than it was when I started in this field in the late 1980s, because there's now a lot more critical research. But beyond academic expertise, I think it's even more important to engage with communities that have not historically had a say in public space, particularly the marginalized communities that have been harmed by these monuments to white supremacy. It's really vital to treat community members as experts in their own right about the effects of these monuments and how these monuments continue to impact their lives. And I think it's equally vital to partner with people in these communities to figure out ways to repair the damage done by these monuments and to open up the memorial landscape to new ideas and new practices. And so this brings me back again, just to conclude, brings me back again to Monument Lab, which has been an organization that has been a real leader in this area. They have been involved in really almost every aspect of the monumental process, including research. But their research is quite different from the kind of research that I've historically done. Their research is actually asking people in communities about the monument landscape. They created a card in the city, which they had over 5,000 people in the city of Philadelphia from diverse group of communities, answered a question: what is an appropriate monument for the city of Philadelphia? They answered this question both in writing and in drawing and so on, and got an incredible database of ideas and knowledge about Philadelphia history and memory that's just really irreplaceable in a way. They did a similar thing in St. Louis, where they asked people to draw maps, draw their own personal maps of the memorial landscape, which was absolutely fascinating. You know, what was included, what was not included, what was there that you wouldn't think of as a monument, raised lots of interesting questions. And they've been working with artists like Sonia Clark that Kilolo mentioned to create new works and new interventions into public space. And finally, empowering activists who've already been doing the work. One of the premises of Monument Lab is that activists have been doing this work for a long time already. They've been engaged in this space. They just haven't necessarily been heard or had, you know, people in authority paying attention to them. So giving a forum for activists to become thought leaders in this area. And I will say then, just to conclude, I think that the more that we open out this conversation beyond conventional monuments and into these other areas, particularly involving communities that have not had a say in the process, the more interesting and inclusive this conversation will become. So thank you, and I'll turn it back to Jessica.
Thank you so much. I am going to actually ask Christy to join us. I'm going to spotlight her here. I just lost it on my screen. Where did you go? Ross, you can help me. Thank you. Christy.
Hello, everybody. So I'm going to try to weave together a little bit here about the role of museums in this conversation, because I think it's critical to understand that museums have been complicit in a lot of this work and the way that the public landscape is viewed and the way that it's been used to perpetuate either white supremacy or some fallacy about the American past. And so, as well as its ideals, right? So, and I'm going to speak to that from the perspective of my former role as the CEO of the American Civil War Museum. Now, at the height of the monuments debates that really began around 2015, and in terms of the more recent fervor, and as Dr. Savage said, the conversations about removing, particularly Confederate statuary, is really something that began as soon as they started to dot the American landscape north and south. And that's the thing that you need to remember, is that these monuments were often placed north and south and west, right? And in fact, many of them were being produced in Boston and New York, mass produced, and communities could, in fact, reach out to these companies, and they could, say, well, I need a belt buckle that says this, and I need a rifle that is reflective of that. So they would customize them, but the face and the body and the posture, there are basically three postures that you could have. And those ended up in smaller towns in front of the courthouses. So, so our museum, the American Civil War Museum, or the museum with which I was affiliated, in and of itself was an interesting institution, in that the American Civil War Museum was the result of a merger between two museums in Richmond. And I was a part of that merger. The private talks began in 2012, and we publicly announced it in 2013, when we had come to an understanding of not only what our governance would be like, but had actually taken a look at some of our legacy related issues, because you see, one of the partner institutions was the former Museum of the Confederacy. And the Museum of the Confederacy, without a doubt, was established in 1896 with the sole purpose of perpetuating the myth of the lost cause and the nobleness of the Confederacy. And the women who were involved in creating that institution were also involved around the country in ensuring that those statues were placed in the first place. How do I know that? Because of the archival collection that came together with this. Their records, their letters, their samples of different types of monuments that they wanted, the rhetoric around why they wanted certain pieces. We had all of that in our collection. So when the conversations were extending, and the city of Richmond determined that a commission, Monument Avenue Commission in particular, was going to be put together to explore these things, I was asked to be a co-chairperson of that. Now, mind you, this is in 2017. We were in the middle of building this new museum, and we were addressing some of these issues of what we were going to do with this collection. That frankly, the two organizations coming together, the American Civil War Center, whose mission it was is to explore the American Civil War and its legacies from multiple perspectives, became our combined mission. But the opportunity and the reality was, when we merged these two institutions, we became part of our collection was no longer balanced. It was now heavily Confederate, or at least that is the way that it had been presented in the past. And this is an extraordinary collection, one that frankly is, particularly with regard to Confederate material, is more compelling than even the Smithsonian, okay? Because this is mean, the families of these Confederate generals and senators and politicians and leading social figures, it was their wives and daughters that started this museum. So they compiled the material. They sent a call out, and 16 of the 17 Confederate generals sent uniforms, saddles, weapons, sent, everything that they had to these women in Richmond. So this was not, and I say 16 of 17, and number 17 is only because he was buried in his uniform, and that's A.P. Hill, right? So fast forward to the Monument Avenue Commission. Our staff, this commission included members of city council, it included community members, it included historians, and our purpose was to get the feel from the community about how they wanted to move. And the reality was Virginia state law at the time prohibited the removal of these statues. Absolutely prohibited. It was against the laws, crime, to remove them, to deface them, to change the name, to put any kind of signage on them. And that was deliberate, and it was done in 1903, the exact same year that they disenfranchised 90% of Black male voters. Okay, so just context, right? So anyway, as we began this work and these conversations that we hosted around the city, needless to say, the first few were just disastrous. I mean, they were people piling in by the hundreds. The Confederati were armed and ready to go. I mean, they had their same arguments that we had heard for 60 years about why they should stay, and this is real history, and you're destroying history, like it or not. And these folks weren't fighting against slavery, they were fighting to preserve states' rights, and yada, 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 yada. None of which was supported by the very documents in our collection that the Confederates themselves collected. And they became our source to inform the community. And that's what we did as a museum. While I was serving in this official capacity as a co-chair of the commission, our museum mined the museum's archives and photographic records and artifacts to create online learning materials and portals in partnership with other museums in Richmond who had, more specific items directed towards the Monument Avenue situation in particular. And we created this sort of mini site, historic site, that just laid bare all of the documentation related to these particular things. And what we found was absolutely extraordinary in that within a month, the page views and the deep dives that people were doing into it was having the impact that we wanted as a museum. We wanted people to learn and to inform themselves. And meanwhile, as a commissioner, we realigned how we were going to be doing these meetings. Under Virginia law, if more than 3 commissioners were gathered, it was a formal public meeting, and there were a lot of community folks who wanted to have the meeting but were concerned about safety, the way that some folks were responding. And so what we did is we scheduled, after the wildness, we started scheduling smaller gatherings, enabling people to, and community organizations and homeowners associations and schools and civic organizations and civil rights organizations could reach out to us, and we would send commissioners out 2 by 2, in addition to the larger public forums that would have 3, 4, or more of us present all over the city in every setting that we could. And we set up online portals to also hear. All of these things have been recorded and kept for future reference. But the point is that when you go into a museum space, you do have an opportunity to use your collections and use the role that you have in public history or public art to really engage your community in a very different way. I mean, museums, I love this sort of more recent thing of museum professionals talking about museums are not neutral. You know, this idea of this false claim of objectivity, because museums have never been that way. They have been, again, perpetuators of a lot of the nonsense that we have dealt with in American culture, in particular world culture, actually. You know, but we also are at a stage and an age in the last 25 to 30 years where the reckoning around all of these issues have come to bear. And so museums become that public space, that combined public space that enable us to explore and enable us to look at, again, the way we have framed our shared past, right? And so I would just encourage you as students of this work to really think about all of the parts. The idea that somehow you're just going to deal with an object and the object alone is, I really hope that that is not what they are teaching you in the museum world anymore. Yes, things have meaning, but things have meaning because how they are placed in societies and how societies rear them. So to stand there and only look at, oh, well, this has a particular filial side to it that was reflective of the so-and-so period, it's useless if it is not a reflection of why these things are created or placed in regard. And like Kilolo, I love Sonia Clark. Sonia Clark was still in Richmond at the time and was producing these works dealing with Confederate iconography, and I'm telling you, it is powerful. So just to say that there are how communities engage with their history and their culture is inside and outside your museum walls, and therefore your museum and how it operates and how it serves needs to be inside and outside its walls. So I'm going to stop there because I know our time is running short, and I was trying to compress myself so that we'd have more time for dialogue and questions. So Jessica, back to you.
Sure, I'm going to spotlight all three of you here. I'm going to, quite frankly, it's the three of you speaking. So I don't know, even though you didn't come together and talk about this, it's been a really great experience. So I sort of just open it up to the three of you. Do you have a question for one of the other speakers right now, or have a comment that you'd like to make on someone else that spoke? Because I don't really want to heavily moderate. I really want to hear the three of you speak. If there's something that, oh gosh, I meant to say this, or I want to comment on this, I wanted to give you the space to do that right now. Anyone? Any takers? Well, then, if not, I will I'll go ahead, Christy, please.
No, I was just going to say, I'd much rather hear the questions from those in attendance.
Yeah, for sure. No problem. That's exactly where I was going to go too. So if anyone wants to type something in right now or put their hand up, I'm going to open with one. And Christy, it was almost exactly what you were ending with. So I don't need to be repetitive, but as you sort of guessed, we have arts administrators. They're about to go into the real world now, right? And although some of them will be in middle management, most of them that are leaving this class are not going to go straight to executive director of a museum right now. So I want to talk about, or if any of you would have any ideas, is how can we prepare them? And we have been talking about exactly what you've been talking about, Christy, but how can we prepare them to go out into the world, be in the community, be in maybe the museum that they're dealing with, and when a controversial piece maybe at their museum is put into the light, or perhaps they're walking around and recognizing, hey, these are pieces that need different context. These are pieces that we, as you were saying, this isn't just about the Baroque nature of this or this sort of thing. How can we empower them, even if they may not be at the top? You know, they may be an associate this or an assistant that. And so I kind of wonder how we can empower them to make sure that they work with the organizations and their communities to contextualize or remove when necessary these objects that have been put into our culture for not the right reasons. And how can we sort of start to do that? And again, when we're not at the top of the food chain, if you will. Anyone want to take a, and as at that, we're still getting some questions in too. And so I'll grab some of those as they come out.
Yeah, I always kind of bucked that before I became top of the food chain, as it were. And I'll
Okay.
tell you how. You do it through creativity. And if you are genuinely interested in hearing what communities have to say, then you have to align with them. And that doesn't just mean when you get your role as the assistant so and so that you're constantly trying to invite people to your museum. You need to be out in those communities. You need to be where people are to hear what they're talking about. If there are community artists, who are creating work and creating a sensation, and really get in there and find out why this piece or this artist is resonating the way they are. Really understand, is your institution again creating more harm? We saw this happen during Black Lives Matter movement. A lot of creative work was being produced around the country by artists of all types, and museums were going out there and collecting, yes, but they were also buying art that was meant for purchase by communities, and therefore greatly undervaluing this work that um, you know a white artist or a more established artist, they would have paid tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars for. But these works artists deliberately produced so that it could be a part of their communities who wouldn't often have access to that. So if you find yourself in those situations, do not add to that. Identify who is being valued, bring it to the table. Look at your comparables, but do not continue to undervalue, particularly artists of color, and art, and women artists are often undervalued as well in the marketplace. So my point is, you have, everybody has a certain level of power and privilege in their organizations. The issue is, are you willing to look at ways that you can wield it to the betterment of the organization? Because I can guarantee you that those in power, especially if they have made sort of these public statements or whatever, which are always fascinating to me, especially given the fact that institutions are having these very hard conversations about what it means to decolonize the way that they work, to get rid of the practices that have been inequitable. And so by bringing in your voice to that conversation that is, again, empowered by what you are seeing and experiencing and the relationships that you are building within those communities, that is where your power lies.
I would also say that even an object itself, we have to look beyond the object. We have to look at how institutions are framed, who has the power and how that power is structured, because we tend to operate in this hierarchy. It's about dominance. And so I think about how these monuments, some of these monuments that are being toppled, removed through, commissions, but also even buildings being renamed. And I also caution people that, yes, this is one part of the change, but we also have to look at who is still making and creating and calling the shots. That's something else that I really think about because of my time working at these predominantly white-led museums. They may buy a work by Latinx or a Black artist, but they still are very much centering, whiteness as the majority within that institution. And so that's something else that I say once again, you arts administrators, when you're out there, whether you're working in these white-led institutions or other institutions, I always say, like, question things, and always don't be afraid to question things, because these names, these building changes, the buildings that are changing names, once again, that's just one step. And we have to really look at the structural, the structural changes that are definitely needed.
Agreed. We have a question from Suraj. Suraj, would you like to unmute and ask your question? Suraj?
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. The conflict sometimes appears when you're trying to transcend your own personal devaluations that have been internalized over, as people of color, that we go through our own personal journeys in a way. And then when we're trying to position ourselves in places where there is power and there's authority and a pre-existing norm, like you were talking about white-led institutions, so to say, how do we emerge from this personal sense of devaluation that has been accumulated over years to even begin occupying that time and space, and let's say just claiming that what you're saying or what you've perceived or what you're trying to bring out in a certain project or in a certain action is valid? I don't know if I confused more than I actually clarified. I think it was better in typing.
I'll go ahead and respond. I was waiting for Kilolo or Kirk to respond. To a certain degree, what you're talking about is sort of like feeling like an imposter syndrome. You've earned your stripes and you embrace them. And yes, it's really hard sometimes when you come into space that is continually devalued, the contributions, or, oh, that's nice, thanks for adding that to the conversation, and they keep it moving. I think you also have to try to find spaces and or colleagues who are going to be supportive of you and that work. So you don't walk away feeling like you're just a crazy person on the staff that nobody understands. So it's about building alliances with others that will support you in this work, and through your combined experience and your combined work together, you'll be able to withstand and stand strong, right? You don't go into these institutions just thinking you just be grateful for a job and you'll just sit there and be quiet. We don't need that. That's shading when it comes to diversity initiatives. That is not real diversity and inclusivity in the workplace. So find those people who have similar experiences that you can share and learn from and support each other. That's how you overcome it, in my view.
Yeah, and it takes time. I mean, you get in there. I mean, we all think that change comes very quickly, but I look at it more of a marathon. And there are these small wins, and then there are those long term, because it takes I mean, I'm still unlearning. I mean, I was raised, I mean, in this kind of colonial mindset, and it's a constant, unlearning, conditioning myself to think outside of this colonial framework that is a global phenomenon. And so I know that I'm still working at it. And I always say that give yourself, some latitude, give yourself some room to make mistakes and say you're sorry when you do mess up, because I think right now society is so averse to saying I'm sorry and being very meaningful and intentional about saying, hey, I'm sorry if I stepped on your toes, or I, said something that was, harsh or racist or, sexist. And I think that we need to do more of that, and also listening to each other. And people that are presidents or executive directors, think because they're in this position that they have all the answers, and no one person has all of the answers. And there are many perspectives, and there's many ways to go about change. And it's not these binaries that, once again, where you're either conservative or you're liberal, or you're Democrat or you're Republican. I'm like, people, let's think critically about things. Let's think for ourselves and not, be so invested in saying, you see somebody who's KKK and they're racist. There's a lot of subtle things that are happening. And so never feel that your voice doesn't matter. As Christy has said, really find people that, can support you and nurture you, and also create spaces that you can grow and learn from one another as well.
Thank you so much. That was very helpful.
We're going to sneak in one last question because I think it's actually a really good one for Kirk. B, would you mind asking your question that you put in that I thought he might have some experience of, because of his work with Monument Lab?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So yeah, I was just thinking about how oftentimes you see, sorry about the dog, you oftentimes see these public forums taking place in the process of confronting potentially controversial monuments or statues. And I'm just wondering how productive you think those are, and when we're thinking about like who is included in the room in those conversations, and some alternative methods of getting input. Oh, I think you might be
Sorry, I
muted.
have to unmute myself. I come at it from a different perspective, being in academia and working with organizations in that space. But I've been involved in public forums like the Art Commission's forum, which is a very that was a kind of a public hearing process, a sort of mandated public hearing process, which is very much performative. And the difference between that and the kinds of methods that an organization like Monument Lab uses to solicit local knowledge and to really tap into local knowledge, that's very different from trying to tap into opinion. It's actually getting it's getting people to contribute their unique expertise to this larger conversation. And so that opens it up in a really different way from what you would hear in a public hearing, where people are kind of taking partisan sides and doing what Kilolo was talking about. I'm, for or against, and I think the more we can do that, there are lots of interesting ways that this has happened. And, in the process that Charlottesville took, for example, prior to the Unite the Right rally, when they were actually soliciting and engaging communities within Charlottesville about what should our public history be? What stories should we be telling about Charlottesville? What stories are we not telling? What stories should we be telling? How should we respond to the monuments that are, so overwhelming in public space? And they did many different kinds of activities involving kind of like what, Dr. Coleman was talking about with, smaller groups and larger groups and more activity-based versus hearing-based, and really got a lot of super interesting contributions from the community that you wouldn't have gotten from a normal sort of public hearing process.
Thank you. I want to acknowledge that, and I'd like to hear if either of the ladies have any comments on that, but we are at 1. I don't want to hold anyone past. We'll finish up with this question, even though there was another awesome question that was just asked that we won't get to, but I just wanted to acknowledge that I don't want to hold anyone before they need to go anything else. Kilolo or Christy, did you have any comments on this concept of between is the public forum the best way, or is maybe a survey the best way, or how we sort of begin and these conversations?
I agree with Kirk, and that was one of the things that we learned, in the Monument Avenue Commission, because it did, as he said, the large public forums were far more performative and far less useful. So when we found different ways for people to give input and for us to query them, as well as opportunities for them to help shape the process itself, we learned quite a bit, and so it was a mix. We had, again, the partnerships with the museums provided the intellectual background, which eventually got added to the website for the city's efforts. The workshops, for lack of a better term, that some of the artist communities started to do, and getting people to think about reimagining what Monument Avenue could be, created some really fascinating concepts. So all of these things would eventually impact the way that we positioned our report back to the mayor, the Monument Avenue Commission report, which was released June 2nd, 2018. It's out there in the public domain, so if you want to read all of the suggestions that were available at the time. What we found most interesting, especially after the summer of 2020, is virtually everything the commission recommended came to bear, even if it didn't come through so-called legitimate means. The monuments were had context added to them because community people started putting up signs in terms of their meaning and their history. Artists and others tagged them and created extraordinary public art and commentary about them. The most dynamic were the nighttime projections on the Robert E. Lee statue. The state legislature changed the law, the century-old law, to allow communities to determine for themselves what happens to public statuary. So we, again, it may not have happened the way that we perhaps conceived it in a more orderly way, but everything happened. And it was an extraordinary piece, but it was, I would like to think that in part it was driven by the fact that the community really did understand. And the rest of it is what it is. And the conversation continues in Richmond and in other parts of Virginia. And rightfully so, the conversations are, what values do we commonly share and how do we best represent that?
Well, thank you. That's actually a really poignant way to end this. If everyone wants to unmute for a minute or put their Zoom applause up, I am very grateful. It is wonderful to be able to connect with so many different people in a Zoom room, but there's also that feeling of not the connection because we're not really together. So I'm really grateful for your time today, really grateful for the knowledge that you're passing on to us. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful afternoon, and please stay in touch, and we're going to end the recording. And thank you so much today. Thank you.
Thank you.